Hi, welcome to Digging for Truth, presented by Associates for Biblical Research. I'm your host, Henry Smith. Today, Bryan Windle is here in the studio with us as we begin a two-part episode on the latest research on Jericho. Bryan, welcome back to Digging for Truth.
It's great to be here.
You are now an in-studio veteran.
Absolutely. This is awesome. I am so excited to be here.
It's great to have you here. You, of course, we've talked before about how you are, in terms of volume, our number one guest. As I called you the second host, as it were, on Digging for Truth. Yeah. But it's great to have you here in the studio.
It's great to be here.
Well, we have a fantastic subject lined up for this and the next episode, and that is the subject of Jericho, which has been research that you have been working on for a number of years, and for your master's thesis. So let's get started. Maybe the first question is, what motivated you to begin looking at the Jericho question?
Yeah, so I was looking for a topic for my master's thesis, and I started looking at Jericho and some of the latest research that was coming out from the team from Sapienza University that had excavated there and had been excavating there for years and years. And what I noticed is that there were very few evangelicals interacting in a meaningful way with their research. And so the more I got into it, the more I started to learn, and I joke about how I fell down the rabbit hole. And now, and what's interesting is that Negro's team now they did another season in 2024, so that's 20 seasons they've dug there. We've excavated at Shiloh for 7, and we've learned so much about the site in 7 seasons. Imagine what you could learn about a site in 20 seasons. And so because very few evangelicals were interacting with that, I wanted to learn more about it. So I just did this deep dive into it. It involved hundreds of hours of research. It involved 2 trips to Israel to actually study the site in person. I went to a couple of museums that had Jericho pottery, the Rockefeller Museum in Jerusalem, the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto, studied that stuff live and in person. I emailed many museums around the world that had pottery in their collections. They sent me that, and then I created this database of all known late Bronze Age artifacts that I could find from Jericho. For the record, 572 late Bronze Age artifacts currently in my database. Then started comparing that with other sites around the area that also had late Bronze Age, and then it all kind of culminated in my thesis, which was entitled "Tell es-Sultan Jericho City 5, the city the Israelites conquered." And so question mark. That's right. And so it's actually coming out soon as a book on Trowel Press. So that's how I came across it.
Yeah, that's fantastic. It's interesting because there was, we're going to talk about Dr. Wood, who's our director of research and has a long history with ABR.
Absolutely.
I did some previous research on Jericho, but there was certainly a gap here. We hadn't done anything updated, and so that's what you're alluding to. So maybe give us a little survey of how your conclusions maybe differ, or a survey of the different conclusions that have been given over more than a century now of different excavations at Jericho.
Absolutely. So the debate about which city Joshua conquered is largely focused on Jericho City 4. Now, our listeners may be aware that these tells, or these mounds, have cities one on top of each other through the millennia, like a layered cake. And people have argued about City 4. When was that destroyed? Because it was clearly destroyed, fiery destruction. And so the different excavators have looked at that. The first excavators, Sellen and Watzinger, after their excavation was over and they looked at some stuff, Watzinger kind of changed his ideas about some of the things, the dating, and essentially his new dating would put what eventually was called City 4 at the end of the Middle Bronze Age. Garstang, of course, famously came along, dug in the 1930s. He's the one who put together the stratigraphy with the city's numbers. City 4, or specifically his City 4-2, is he said it was destroyed in the late Bronze Age. And he identified Joshua and the Israelites as the people who destroyed it. Kathleen Kenyon comes along, digs in the 1950s, and she says, no, City 4 was destroyed in the Middle Bronze Age, end of Middle Bronze Age. And so So that's kind of where things stood. Famously, in 1990, Dr. Bryan Windle published his article on Jericho, and he believed that Kathleen Kenyon had misdated the site based largely on the absence of Cypriot pottery. And so that's where the debate has raged since.
Back and
yeah,
forth,
that's right. Now the new excavations there, led by Lorenzo Negro and his team from Sapienza University, have upheld Kathleen Kenyon's date.
Right.
That City 4 was destroyed at the end of the Middle Bronze. But according to their stratigraphy, City 5 was the late Bronze Age city, and there was occupation there. And so my thesis has come in, and what I've done is I've said, is there evidence that City 5 was the city that the Israelites destroyed? And so what I did was I started with Scripture, because we always start there. It's with Scripture and archaeology. I put together a simple criterial screen with evidence from the Bible that it was occupied, fortified, and destroyed, and some details about that. And then I looked at City 5, the evidence that we could come up with, and I've come to the conclusion that I believe City 5 was the city that the Israelites destroyed. And Dr. Bryan Windle and I have come to different conclusions. One of the things that I love about ABR is they allow scholars to have different conclusions as long as we hold to the primacy of Scripture. And I really do think that I'm building on Dr. Wood's research. There's just new information now that he didn't have available to him when he published his, and he presented a plausible explanation for City 4 with the evidence that he had. I'd like to present a plausible explanation for City 5 as the city that Joshua's army conquered, based on the latest research from Jericho.
Yeah, sure. You know, it's really important. We were talking before the show philosophically how we want to try to find the truth of what the archaeology reveals as best we can, but there is a tentative nature to it as well, right? There's always incomplete data. There's different ways to interpret it. There's misunderstandings about how it's interpreted and all that other kind of thing, right? So kind of approaching it loosely, if you want to say.
We hold our conclusions loosely.
Yeah.
I mean, we look at it and we go, the Bible says that Joshua and the Israelites conquered Jericho and that the walls came tumbling down. So we're going to hold to that.
Yes.
Which stratum is to be associated with it? The stratigraphy of Jericho, the archaeology there is very difficult and confusing, and so we have to hold those loosely.
So maybe we could, you could begin the end of this segment by introducing maybe a little bit about the evidence about City 4 from what we would call the right time period that fits the Bible, and then we can bridge over to the next segment. Sure. Maybe a little tutorial on that.
Yeah. Okay. So the pottery from City 4, as I've reached out to different people, I've communicated with multiple times with the world's leading expert on late Bronze Age pottery. It's Dr. Robert Mullins from Azusa Pacific University. He literally wrote the chapter on late Bronze Age pottery in the latest book on ceramic typology that we use at Shiloh, that Diggs use all over Israel. And as he looked at the pottery, he has said, the pottery from City 4 is Middle Bronze Age pottery. Now, there's a very famous pottery plate that we've used at ABR, that Dr. Bryan Windle has used and others use. I've used it too. That when he looked at that, Dr. Mullins looked at that and he said, no, that's actually just an MB2C, MB3 assemblage. He would say that City 4 was destroyed at that particular time frame. And so now I will admit that pottery from the Middle Bronze Age going into the Late Bronze Age 1 period, some of the forms continue, right? And so you look at some of these, you go, okay, it could be LB1, it could be MB3, which one is it? And what you have to do is you have to look at all of them together, the entire assemblage together. And when you do that, I believe, looking at the latest book on ceramic typology, talking to experts, that the pottery from City 4 is indeed Middle Bronze Age pottery. There's Late Bronze Age pottery there, but I believe it's associated with City 5.
Okay. So we're looking at here, your alternative explanation of the evidence or interpretation of the evidence is that the City 4 material is largely before Joshua.
That's correct.
And we're gonna talk more about that after the break. And friends, we'll be right back after this message. Are you interested in digging even deeper for the truth? Then please visit the ABR website at BibleArchaeology.org and click on Bookstore. There you'll find a wide variety of resources designed to defend the Christian faith. Archaeology, apologetics, the text of Scripture, Creation Evolution, even study Bibles. You can pick up the perfect gift for the sincere seeker or fellow Christian. Visit Bible Archaeology and click on Bookstore today. Hi, welcome back to Digging for Truth. I'm here with Bryan Windle. We're talking about Jericho. Okay, so the City 4 destruction of Jericho, which Dr. Wood felt need to be redated, you believe probably shouldn't be redated, and we obviously have an alternative theory for the destruction that it came later, and the evidence is there. So we should clarify that.
Sure, yeah.
But some more analysis of the City 4 material, I think would be helpful for our audience, particularly those who are familiar with this discussion.
Absolutely, and probably the one thing that people will think right away, if you followed this and our work at ABR on it, is what about the jars of burnt grain?
Yes.
Because there were jars of burnt grain that seems to align with the methodology of the attack, the timing of the attack, and on the surface it absolutely does. But does that mean that that City 4 then is late Bronze Age? I don't think so necessarily, and here's why. There were jars of burnt grain that were also found in City 3 at Jericho, in an MB2 context, Middle Bronze context, far before Joshua. And jars of burnt grain have been found at Tel el-Hammam in an IB level, a Middle Bronze level, an Iron Age destruction level. At Hatzor, they've found jars of burnt grain in a 13th century destruction level. And so jars of burnt grain, while not common, is not maybe the smoking gun that everybody thinks it is. Because it's been found at other sites too. And then when they actually look at the carbon tested some of the grain, the carbon testing at Jericho has been a little bit hit and miss, but the most consistent one and the latest one has been very uniform, and it shows that Jericho City 4 was destroyed at the end of the Middle Bronze Age.
Right. Okay, so just to give the picture of it, Dr. Wood's proposal was that Kenyon had improperly dated the destruction of City 4. It should be associated with Joshua. You're saying you think the evidence indicates that that destruction actually is earlier, but that doesn't negate the biblical account because you find evidence in the next phase that fits with Joshua. This is so interesting, Bryan.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is good. I think we've set the stage quite well. So now, one of the things that you do also in your approach, and we're going to return to the archaeology over these two episodes. I like the approach that you're taking with the dating of this, because you have to correlate this with the Bible.
Absolutely.
And of course, pottery timeframes. So you have taken what you call a window approach, a chronological window. Explain that to the audience and give us some details.
Sure. As I looked into the dating of the Exodus and then 40 years wandering, the conquest. One of the things that I increasingly became uncomfortable with is people who pinpoint a specific year or a specific day even. There's a scholar who does a specific day. And part of that, what makes me uncomfortable is I see too much imprecision in the biblical text, the more that I studied it. So we all start at 1 Kings 6:1. 1 Kings 6:1, we have to start there. It's the clearest, it's not the only, but certainly the clearest one we use for dating. And it says this: in the 480th year, after the people of Israel came out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Zim, which is the 2nd month, he began to build the house of the Lord. So if we know when the 4th year of Solomon's reign is, and some scholars would pinpoint that to 967 BC, you count back 479 years because it's in the 480th year, and you come to 1446 BC. And that seems pretty simple, except that that's the date we get from the Masoretic text, which is what the Hebrew text that our Bibles are based on. The Greek text, the Septuagint, which actually predates the Masoretic text, it reads, as you know, because you wrote an excellent article on this, it reads the 440th year. So that would mean that the Exodus was in 1406, if we go by that date. This same textual variant is also found in the Latin manuscripts, with the older Latin one reading 440th, and the Latin Vulgate, which is later, reading 480th. And so as you start to look into this, some really important manuscripts read 440th. And you have to remember that the Greek text was based on a Hebrew text. So you see where there's some imprecision here. Essentially, we have two, what I believe are viable biblical dates for the Exodus, and I can't conclusively say it's one or the other. And then you look at the anchor date, of 967. Roger Young has argued convincingly of that. I would probably side to that, but I would also note that Edwin Thiele thought it was 966. I would also note Kenyon thought it was 960, and Albright thought it was 959. So there is this, again, a
little bit
debate.
on that one, a little bit of a window.
There's a little window,
few
right?
years,
And that's our very anchor date. And then you start looking at the different types of archaeology. The way we date archaeology, you've got ceramic typology, the pottery, right? It's not like every pottery woke up on January 1st, 1400 BC and said, okay, everybody, we got to change the type of pottery. We're going with a new type of pottery right now, right?
That.
So there's this
window.
There's this window we have there. And the chronology of the late Bronze Age is tied to Egyptian chronology, specifically the 18th dynasty. And Egyptologists like Hoffelmeyer and Bitek and Kenneth Kitchen have noted there's a 20-year plus or minus window of error among the chronology. We can't even agree on when these pharaohs reigned. And then you've got carbon dating, which also has a window. So here's how I put it all together. I take those two dates, the two possible biblical dates from the Masoretic text or from the Septuagint for the conquest. That's either 1406 or 1366. And then I take a 20-year plus or minus window of margin of error window, which closes my gap and gives me an 80-year window that I look at. I would say I am still an early date Exodus guy. Absolutely I am. And I would still say I hold to a biblical date. I'm just using a window because I want a more nuanced approach. If we go to a single date, we insist on a single date, then we have to force all of our archaeological dates to nail on that 1 year. That's not how archaeology works. We get this window, and so if we go from 1426 to 1346, I am confident that the conquest and the fall of Jericho occurred sometime within that time frame.
Right.
And I'm going to look for archaeological evidence that supports that.
That fits in that. Yeah. You did a great job of explaining all that. You and I have talked about this extensively. Yeah. And when I wrote that research article on 1 Kings 6:1, I thought I was going to resolve the problem. Now I've concluded that 480 is the right number. That's my own inclusion. But the text, but for other reasons. So the text itself, as I conclude, is not a slam dunk. Yeah. The evidence for the 440 is actually quite ancient, and we have to be honest about that. That's right. Even though I would say I think 480 is correct. It's interesting, but you've made me just think a little bit more about your idea about the window, and I like it because we can sort of operate within that and see how the evidence shakes itself out. Like, does it start to move this way? Does it start to move that way? Kind of see where it goes. Yeah. Well. We need to take a break, Brian, so we'll be right back after this message. We'll see you on the other side.
Watch Lighthouse TV wherever you go. Available on Roku, Amazon Fire TV, and Apple TV. Search Lighthouse TV online on your streaming device or go to our website, lighthousetv.org, for more information.
Hi, welcome back to Digging for Truth. I'm here with Bryan Windle. We're talking about Jericho, and this is the first of 2 episodes of Digging for Truth on this subject. Okay, Bryan, we were talking about chronology. Now we need to get back to the pottery discussion, right? Because this is archaeology. This is kind of where the rubber hits the road in archaeology. So now your alternative theory, City 5, not City 4. Okay, so let's talk about some of the details of that the pottery.
Absolutely. So if the team from Sapienza University is correct, then according to their stratigraphy, which harmonizes all of the previous data from the previous digs with their own, City 5 was the city in the late Bronze Age. And so the first thing we would look at in my criterial screen is there evidence for occupation? And the primary way we do that is we look at the pottery. And so what's really interesting is that pottery has been found on the Tell, late Bronze Age pottery, all around the outside of it, and specifically the bulk of it right on the top of a place called Spring Hill. It's the hill on the eastern side of the Tell that overlooks the spring. It was the prime real estate. That's why it's a series of palaces, one on top of the other there. And Garstang excavated a late Bronze Age structure called the Middle Building. And within the middle building and in and around it, there is all of this late Bronze Age painted pottery that has been discovered. And it has been discovered by every single excavation that's been there. The Sellon and Watzinger discovered pottery there. Garstang discovered pottery there. Some people say Kathleen Kenyon didn't discover pottery or said she didn't. That's false. She absolutely did. She published it in her thing. So she found some.
Your research bears that out.
Absolutely. Yeah. And then you have the archaeology of the Italian-Palestinian team most recently, who have also found they've only published one sherd of it, but it's clearly a late Bronze Age Cypriot milk jug piece.
We want to wait to see more from them.
That's right.
And but you've got 4 other excavations that show this.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so now the middle building is difficult to. It's difficult to date stratigraphically because it was covered by this erosional layer, and so the question has become: this pottery, was it part of the erosional layer, or was it part of the building, and should it be used to date the building, or was the building before that? And for his part, Garstang used it to date the building. And when he first published it, he published it as late Bronze Age 1 pottery, so 15th century. But what not many people know is that he changed his mind on that later. Okay. He changed his mind and said no, based on the excavations at Beth Shan, he changed it to LB2, which gave him a problem because he had identified the middle building with City 4. So what he did was he disassociated it with City 4. He still believed City 4 was the city that fell to Joshua, and he said this must just come from a later period. Now, here's where things get interesting. That pottery that caused him to change his mind is the very pottery that that scholars like Brian Wood and Titus Kennedy and others point to say this is late Bronze Age 1 pottery. Garstang changed his mind and said late Bronze Age 2. Okay. As I've reached out to Bob Mullins, he too says it's late Bronze Age 2. This is this famous bichrome pottery that's 2 colors. The question is it true Cypriot or is it just standard Canaanite red and black? And that's where the debate comes. And Mullins would say that it is just standard Canaanite red and black that dates to the LB2A period, so just into the 14th century BC. But within my chronological window. Yeah. There's also pottery from a house. People who've said, Kathleen Kenyon said there was nothing there when Joshua was there. That's just false because she actually excavated a late Bronze Age building. She excavated a late Bronze Age house. She found 3 walls. She found an oven. She found a dipper juglet there. And she dated the dipper juglet to the 14th century BC. In fact, this is what she said. She said, "The evidence seems to me to be that of a small fragment of a building which we have found that is part of a kitchen of a Canaanite woman, who may have dropped the juglet beside the oven and fled at the sound of the trumpets of Joshua's men." Now, when I recite that or read that quote to people, they often stop and they go, "Wait, what? I thought Kathleen Kenyon said there was no Jericho for Joshua to conquer." That's not what she said. That's been attributed to her. Yeah. But actually what she said was this: all of the canons of historical criticism demand that we accept the main facts of the story of the conquest of Jericho as authentic, because it was obviously an event of great importance in the ultimate dominance of Israelites in Palestine, and the wealth of detail makes it clear it was a faithful record. I'm not sure that we have, as evangelicals, and I include myself in this, have accurately nor charitably at times represented her views. Now, she didn't really care about the dating of it. But to suggest that she said there was no late Bronze Age occupation at Jericho is false. Moreover, to suggest that she wasn't aware of John Garstang's pottery that he found is also false, because she mentions it in 2 of her books, Digging Up Jericho and Archaeology of the Holy Land. And so we have a second piece of evidence of pottery that's there, again, fits within my chronological window, right? End of 15th century, beginning of 14th century, right in that window. And then finally, we have the pottery from the tombs. Garstang excavated 3 tombs that were constructed in the Middle Bronze Age, but used in the Late Bronze Age at the time we believe that Joshua was there. And there were a number of vessels in there. There were clearly late Bronze Age vessels. So biconical amphorae are only late Bronze Age. There's no, it's not a continuation of the Middle Bronze Age. There were base ring jars there. Now, Garstang dated this to late Bronze Age 1. And so people like Bryant have used it to say this was City 4. However, I would look at this and some of the subsequent dating. Kenyon dated it. She believed that it would dated to the LB2A period, saying they were reused between 1400 and 1350, 1325 BC.
So that's a range in there.
That's a range, a window, but it touches upon my chronological window. And then we have Negro, who says that the goods from Tomb 5 date to about 1450 to 1400, so that's end of the 15th century, LB1B. But then the goods from tombs 4 and 13 were from about 1375 to 1325, so into the 14th century, LB2A. And so I would look at that and I would say the evidence from the tombs would to me show that there was occupation at Jericho from the end of the LB1 period into the LB2A period, which again fits right within the chronological window that I've established. So for my first criterial screen, is there evidence of occupation? The pottery on the tell, the pottery from the middle building, from the dipper juglet from Kathleen Kenyon's building, and the pottery from the tombs would all suggest that City 5 was occupied sometime near the end of the 15th century into the 14th century, right within my chronological window.
In the window of time where you could place the events of Joshua and the conquest of Jericho. Well, that was quite a tour de force, Brian. And so it was excellent survey of the evidence that obviously shows that you're well versed in this, that you've spent a lot of time in studying it. And so again, we're doing this for people to consider the evidence, right? We want to give an updated report, which is what you're doing here, as to getting a fuller picture of the Jericho information. I find it fascinating that we now have an alternative theory to work with. We shouldn't be intimidated by this. Nope. We shouldn't be worried about it. We should be really rejoicing that we have the ability to examine all this information. All right, Brian. Well, we're going to have you back for part 2 because we have a lot more to talk about. If our friends listening thought that was a lot, we've got more to come.
That's right.
And friends, we'll be right back after this message.
Digging for Truth is produced and recorded in the studios of Lighthouse TV. Positively different.
Hi, welcome back to Digging for Truth. I'm here with Bryan Windle. We're talking about Jericho. Okay, so you're presenting an alternative theory for the destruction date of Jericho, the archaeology in what we call City 5, right? Not City 4.
That's right.
There's a couple of pieces of evidence that fit with that in your judgment. We have a scarab, and we also have this interesting tablet that was discovered. So I turn it over to you.
Yeah, so we are talking about, is there evidence for occupation of City 5 around the time that the Bible would indicate that the Exodus, or the conquest rather, took place? Yes. And I use a window approach, and so I would kind of put that sometime at the end of the 15th century, early 14th century window, based on whether the Masoretic text is correct, the 480th year after the children of Israel came out of Egypt, according to 1 Kings 6:1, Solomon started building the temple, or whether the Septuagint is correct and it was the 440th year. So we've got these two dates, which kind of gives me a window, because I think there are two viable biblical dates that we need to consider. Sure. And I just don't have it conclusively one way or the other. So we talked last time about pottery. Pottery from the Tell, the pottery from Garsting's middle building, from Kenyon's house, and from the tombs, that shows that City 5 was occupied within my chronological window for the conquest. Now we're going to talk about scarabs, because within the tombs, Garsting found scarabs of 3 different pharaohs, Thutmose III and Hatshepsut. Those were both found in Tomb 5, and then Amenhotep III found in Tomb 4. Now there was another Thutmose III scarab found, but it was in an Iron Age context, so I'm not going to consider that. I want to consider these scarabs because they are in late Bronze Age tombs, and they are late Bronze Age pharaohs. And I believe that they demonstrate, the series of them demonstrate occupation there. And so when we look at, now we get into dating though with this, and it depends on whether you take the high chronology or the low chronology. But
this is Egyptian
this is
chronology.
Egyptian chronology,
Yep,
yes. We noted last time that there is this kind of 20-year plus or minus window of error, and part of it depends on this dating of the Egyptian chronology. And so for my dates that I use for the high chronology, I use Charles Ayling, who's an Egyptologist. And then for the low chronology, I use that of Ian Shaw, which is a pretty accepted and probably the conventional dates that are cited now.
Right.
Most Egyptologists use the low dating now. The older generation used the high chronology. And so, but here's the interesting thing. Thutmose III Scarab, very famous pharaoh, probably the most powerful pharaoh of all.
Yes,
So not surprising to see his scarabs. I compare it to when I was a child, I collected hockey cards. And everybody wanted a Wayne Gretzky hockey card because he was the greatest hockey player who ever played. And so that's a little bit like Thutmose III, right? The greatest pharaoh. There were lots of
I've never heard that comparison.
Yeah, lots of scarabs.
It would be like the Tom Brady of the kind of thing.
That's right.
Yeah.
So,
That's so
so,
funny.
you know, okay, so there were lots of those. Hatshepsut was not a popular pharaoh.
Yes.
In fact, she was a female pharaoh, and she ruled. Started out kind of co-regency, and then kind of declared herself pharaoh. But afterwards, her monuments were defaced as they tried to erase her memory. And Dr. Bryant Wood points this out, and I think rightly, that because her scarabs were not collected. This is a very helpful scarab to date occupation there. And then we come to Amenhotep III. Amenhotep III, very popular pharaoh as well. And so scarabs generally are not always that helpful because they were used long afterwards, unless they're found in an occupational level, a stratum that dates to the same time as the pharaoh. And that is the case with the Amenhotep III scarab. It was found in a stratum in the tomb that Garstang dated based on his dating to LB1, but subsequent scholars have said it's actually LB2A stuff. So the scarab dates to the time of Amenhotep III. And it doesn't matter whether you use the high or the low chronology, Amenhotep III is a 14th century pharaoh. So what that seems to me is when you look at the scarab evidence, you have a series of scarabs through the late 15th century into the early 14th century. Again, similar with the pottery, seems to fit within my chronological window, showing that it was occupied at that time. And then we have the very famous cuneiform tablet that was discovered there.
Yes, yes.
And so this tablet, and only one was discovered at Jericho. Garstang found it. And he said that it is, he described it as most similar to the Tel El Amarna tablets. Now, we've done episodes on the Amarna tablets. They were found at a site called Tel El Amarna, and they are the diplomatic correspondence with Egyptian pharaohs, specifically Amenhotep III and Akhenaten, largely those two pharaohs who are 14th century pharaohs. And so that's when they reigned. And so he described it as most like that. He said it's probably similar to them, if not one of them. Now, here's the thing: is only a few lines could be read, nothing that could be dated. But if it is an Amarna tablet or dates to that period, then it dates again to the 14th century. Again, we're within my chronological window for an early dating for the Exodus. In fact, Negro himself, Lorenzo Negro, the current excavator there, has said this: on the eastern flank of the Tell, Garstang retrieved a late Bronze Age tablet preserving an administrative text, which suggests the city still had a political role, a palace, a ruler, and even an archive. So this is not some minor, unfortified site like Bienkowski, who wrote a book on late Bronze Age Jericho, suggested. This seems that there is some prominence still
Something
there.
important about us.
Absolutely,
Yes,
and so we have that. There are other things that I have in my database too. There's a figurine that has been found there that again dates to about the same time frame. And so when we look at the pottery, when we look at the scarabs, when we look at the tablet, the figurine, it all tells us that City 5 was occupied around the time of Joshua and the Israelites.
Yeah, that's a great survey of that. A question on the tombs. If my memory serves correctly, there's basically two different. There's a couple different types of tombs. You can have like a cave tomb where you've got implements in there from all kinds of different time periods. But there's also what are called pit tombs.
Yes.
These
are pit tombs.
These are pit tombs.
Yes.
So you can get a better occupational history of when the scarab showed up, as it were,
That's right.
and associated with the pottery,
Yeah.
as opposed to a cave tomb, which you don't have.
At least one of them was a pit tomb, I know.
Yeah.
And so, and he, Garstang, in his writing on the tombs, he published his work in the Liverpool Anthology of Anthropology and Archaeology, and he described the tomb layers as stratified. In fact, he gave each layer A, B, C, D, E, and the topmost layers were the late Bronze Age, and the lower ones were the Middle Bronze Age.
It's so interesting. People living in the ancient world didn't know how much of a blessing that would be to future archaeologists, as opposed to a cave tomb.
That's right.
Right. So great for us as we're able to study the occupational history of Jericho. Well, friends, thank you for joining us here for Digging for Truth. We're here with Bryan Windle. We'll be right back after this break.
Bible and Spade is a non-technical quarterly publication published by the Associates for Biblical Research. Written from a scholarly and conservative viewpoint, Bible and Spade supports the inerrancy of the biblical record and is a must-read for both the serious Bible student and anyone asking if they can really trust the Bible. Archaeological evidence, properly interpreted, upholding the history of the Bible. Subscribe today at BibleArchaeology.org.
Hi, welcome back to Digging for Truth. I'm here with Bryan Windle. We're talking about the archaeology of Jericho. Okay, Bryan. So, just as a very quick summary, we had the destruction of City 4, which Dr. Wood had believed should be correlated with the event in Joshua, and we have what's called City 5, the next occupation, and you're presenting an alternative theory for the destruction of Jericho and how this evidence might correlate with the book of Joshua. One of the things that we need in that correlation is fortifications. This is very important, right? Architecture, how the cities were built, and so on. So what are the goods as far as City 5 goes with fortifications?
Yes, City 5 does us no good if it didn't have a city wall.
Yes.
Because the very famous story in Joshua, the book of Joshua, the walls come tumbling down. And so my research, again, is just based on the latest research from Jericho. The latest stratigraphy says City 4 was Middle Bronze Age, destroyed about 150 years before Joshua. But City 5 was occupied. We've already demonstrated that. Now we need to say, was it fortified? What were the city walls like there? And so I should maybe just note one quick thing. There have been people like Bienkowski and others who have suggested that cities in the late Bronze Age were largely unfortified. And Hansen did a study which was very helpful, where he completed a study of 30 late Bronze Age sites mentioned in the book of Joshua. 19 of them specifically are said to have been fortified. They had walls or gates or something like that. And when he went and looked at the excavation reports from those, what he found was that 16 of the 19, 84%, have evidence of being fortified.
That's pretty consistent with the biblical text.
That's right. So the biblical text of describing city walls that were fortified is affirmed by the archaeology from these sites, and it's also affirmed by the archaeology at Jericho. Now, when you go to Jericho today, and if any of our viewers have been to Jericho, for sure they've probably seen this very famous stone revetment wall. We call it the Cyclopean wall. It's given that term because I guess ancient people thought that only Cyclops could put these big stones in there. So we call this wall the Cyclopean wall. So this gigantic stone wall. Now, everybody agrees it was built in the Middle Bronze Age, right? Middle Bronze Age 3, the last phase of the Middle Bronze Age. So everybody knows that 15th century, this stone wall was built then. But it was reused in the late Bronze Age, so late 15th century into the 14th century. And what they did is they kept the stone wall, but they rebuilt a mud brick superstructure on top of it. So you've got a bottom stone base, and then mud brick walls on top of that. Negro has noted, the current excavator says the burnt and collapsed mud brick MB3 defensive system was refurbished by adding a mud brick wall on top of the surviving crest of the Cyclopean wall. And so there's a very, very good example of this at Beersheba. If you go to Beersheba today, they have rebuilt the walls there, and you can see stone base with mud bricks on top. I think we have a picture, and it gives a good idea of what the walls of Jericho may have looked like. Now, Negro's team has excavated another portion of that Cyclopean wall on the southern slope of the Tell, and they have found the remains of mud brick, a few courses of mud brick on top of the Cyclopean wall. And so he notes that in the late Bronze Age 1-2 period, they rebuilt this mud brick wall on top. They set it back 20 to 30 centimeters, and they erected it so that it was tall. And then he went back through the excavation reports, it appears, from all the previous teams that excavated there, and he found the same thing. A few mud brick courses on the surviving crest of the MB3 Cyclopean wall. And so he suggests that even though the excavators didn't recognize it as such, that's the same thing he found, and he says that is the remains of the fortifications of City 5. It had a stone revetment wall and then a mud brick wall on top of that. And so in one publication, he's taken a photo from Garstang, and he's actually drawn an arrow to these mud bricks. And he says he's written the LB1-2 mud brick wall on top of the Cyclopean wall. You can see the same thing in this photo from Sullen and Watzinger, and he's identified it even in Kenyon's reports. And so since the walls of Jericho in the late Bronze Age were built on top of this Cyclopean wall, and this revetment wall, the Cyclopean wall, has been tracked around a lot of parts of the Tell over the course of the last 100 years of excavations. This is very helpful for us because it tells us what size the city was at that time. And so basically what Negro has concluded is that it was approximately 4.5 hectares in size. That's 11 acres. And so that would be a city that would hold maybe 2,000 people. For comparison, Hatzor was 84 hectares, or 207 acres. Lachish, 8 hectares, 20 acres. Megiddo, 20 hectares, or 49 acres. What we're saying is this, that Jericho has taken on this almost city of mythical proportions. And some of the drawings that we see of it, it looks like this massive city. In reality, it was a relatively small, modest-sized city, but clearly fortified. City 5 was fortified, clearly fortified in the late Bronze Age. Now, here's the interesting thing. Kenyon has a very famous quote that if you take it out of context, she says, something along the lines of the famous city walls, not a trace remains. That's because she believed that these walls were City 4's walls, not the late Bronze Age walls. She wasn't saying there were no walls. She actually says they probably just eroded over time, but she believed that they were there at one time. Negro is now going back, to be clear, and saying those walls you thought were from City 4 were actually from City 5. You thought they were Middle Bronze. They're actually late Bronze. And that's the latest research that we have now from Jericho, from the current excavator.
So he's associating. So Kenyon associated those famous fallen red bricks, with the picture that we've shown many times in our different ABR productions. She had associated with a pre-Joshua destruction.
That's right.
Negro is saying no, it's later, which would fit within your chronological window and fits what the biblical text says. And we have details like they went up into the city. How did they get up over the Cyclopean wall? This could have been possibly a viable way of getting up. It's so interesting to sort of see the hybrid nature of the archaeological evidence here, isn't it?
And I want to be clear, Negro does not believe in the story of Joshua. He does not believe that this was an actual historical event.
Right.
He's just giving us the archaeology,
and
we're coming along and going, oh, look how that aligns with what the Bible says.
Yeah, this is fascinating. Great job, man. All right, we got to go to a break, and we'll be right back after this message.
In a culture of intense Bible-denying skepticism, Associates for Biblical Research exists to strengthen followers of Jesus by affirming the authority of the Bible. Our archaeological fieldwork and original research form a strong foundation in upholding the reliability of the Scriptures for students or anyone asking if they can really trust the Bible. Please visit our website and partner with us by joining our prayer team or financially supporting this ministry. And thank you for standing with us.
Hi, welcome back to Digging for Truth. I'm Henry Smith, I'm your host, and I'm here with my friend Bryan Windle. We're talking about Jericho. Okay, Bryan, what do you have next for us? I mean, as if we haven't covered enough already. We got more to talk about.
All right.
Exciting subject.
So we've looked at City 5. Was it occupied? And the pottery and the Scarabs and the cuneiform tablets says, yes, City 5 was occupied around the time the Bible says Joshua attacked the city. We've looked, was the city fortified? Yes, it was. The latest excavations seem to indicate that it was fortified, refortified using the old MB3 Middle Bronze Age Cyclopean wall with a new mud brick wall on top. Now we're going to talk about destruction, because if the Bible is correct and historically accurate, and I believe it is, then we would expect to find some evidence of destruction there. And so the Bible, the book of Joshua, records that the walls of the city fell, and Dr. Bryant Wood correctly points out that the Hebrew indicates they fell beneath themselves. And so we would take a look at that. Now, I do want to note that City 5, unlike City 4, which has a very nice stratigraphy, City 5 is much harder stratigraphically because those in the Iron Age scraped the tell off to rebuild a significant Iron Age city there. So we don't have as quite of clear of data that we do have for City 4, but it's not missing. There is data there. So let's talk about the collapsed walls. I recently read an article that Negro wrote about Jericho in the late Bronze Age. It was published in a obscure German Festschrift that was, thankfully he had published his part in English, but it was very hard to get and it was obscenely expensive, but we were able to get a copy of it and read this, and this is what he says in it. He says, the late bronze mud brick wall was recognized by Kenyon in the trenches she excavated at the western, that's Trench 1, the northern, Trench 2, and the southern, Trench 3 sides of the tell. Now, I had to stop there for a second because I was like, wait a minute. Kenyon never said she excavated late Bronze Age walls. What is he talking about? So I followed his footnote. I go back to what he is attributing Kenyon's work to the late Bronze Age. And as I read it, I was like, oh my goodness, I've heard this before. Because when you go to what he says Kenyon found, and he says this was late Bronze Age mud brick walls, remember, she thought it was Middle Bronze.
Yes.
Here's what she wrote. There was a heavy fill of fallen red mud bricks piling to the top of the revetment. And there was this famous cross-sectional diagram that we have used for years because Dr. Bryant Wood, when he read the excavation report, he went, that's describing exactly what the Bible describes. And you can see on the side drawing, and I think he was the one who colorized it, the red mud bricks kind of creating almost a siege ramp up into the city.
Yes.
And so those are the fallen mud bricks that Negro is saying are from City 5 from the late Bronze Age. So here's what I'm saying. Bryant had it right. He correctly identified that as the late Bronze Age mud brick walls. He associated it with City 4 because that's what Kenyon had associated it with.
Sure.
Negro is now saying, no, it's City 5's walls. And so we have these, if he's correct, then we have evidence now of those collapsed walls. And this is where I think my research is building upon Bryant's research, right? He looked at that and he said, that is the walls. And now we have research that says, hey, City 5, those are City 5's walls. And that comes right from the lead excavator himself. And
which in a way is he's a hostile witness in a sense.
Absolutely.
Because he doesn't believe in the veracity of the biblical account.
That's right.
So it's not some Bible thumping fundamentalist
That's right.
doing the and at least at this moment, this is where he's dating the fallen walls.
That's right.
Yeah, this is so interesting, isn't it? So we'll see if he changes his mind. That's possible, right?
Yep.
Or he could double down because he finds more evidence consistent with his claim thus far.
Right.
So this is what we have so far. And we'll continue to see as he publishes more and that sort of thing.
Yeah, at this point we have the statements that he's made, but I've not yet seen all of his data. We have to wait for his final excavation report, which is why we hold these theories kind of loosely as we look at that. So we have collapsed walls. That matches the biblical account. Then we have destruction. When you read Kathleen Kenyon's report, when it talks about her late Bronze Age house, it notes specifically in there for phase 54, a destruction. Now, unfortunately, she doesn't give any evidence of what that destruction is. She just says it was destroyed with that particular phase. But she did later write about that, and she said this: as concerns the date of the destruction of Jericho by the Israelites, all that can be said at this is that the latest Bronze Age occupation should, in my view, be dated to the third quarter of the 14th century BC. This is a date which suits neither the school of scholars who date the entry of the Israelites into Palestine to 1400 BC, nor the school who prefers the date of 1260 BC. But I would note it touches right upon my chronological window when we realize the imprecision in the biblical text and the imprecision with archaeology. So again, we have now evidence of destruction within this chronological window we set out for Jericho. And then finally, the question becomes, what about the destruction by fire? Because Jericho is one of the 3 cities that we're told in the Bible were destroyed by fire. I think when modern people read that, what comes to their minds is Dresden in World War II. Yeah. Massive conflagration of the entire site wide.
Or something like Tokyo, the firebombing of Tokyo, something like that.
So that's what comes to mind. But I'm not sure that needs to be what the Bible is actually saying, because there is rhetorical language that's used in the book of Joshua. So, for example, when I played hockey as a kid, we all went to the same school, but we were on different teams, and we would kind of taunt our opponents that we were going to play that night. We would say, you're dead meat. There's just going to be a massacre tonight. Now, did we literally mean we were going to literally kill them? No, we were using rhetorical language. And so when the Bible says they burned the city with fire, that could be rhetorical language. It doesn't mean they didn't burn the city. They did. But when you go and look at Hatzor, for example, in the 15th century, it looks like the destruction by fire is limited to the city gate and maybe one of the temples. Could they have come to Jericho and burned the city gate or the palace or the temple? There's a temple at the top there too.
Maybe something representing the power of the city is what you're suggesting.
That's what I'm suggesting. And so we need not find a massive burn layer over the entire site, but if we find some evidence of it, that would satisfy it. Now, Negro, in one of his presentations, he said this: the late Bronze Age ended in some kind of conflagration, and then there's a gap. The late Bronze Age ends in a fierce destruction, which is, however, not clearly documented, as it was excavated by the first 2 excavations in a non-reconstructible way. So he's saying there is some evidence of fire there, but he doesn't give us any specifics. And then he further notes that there's a drought of archaeological evidence in the last century of the late Bronze Age, during the Ramesside area reign of Egypt, which has been interpreted as an abandonment of the site. So that means 13th century, not much there, abandonment, which would imply that this conflagration he's talking about happened sometimes in the 14th century. That's as close as we can get based on what he's published yet. But I would say we have evidence now of not just occupation, fortification, but also destruction, all within the time frame the Bible says.
Awesome. Well, Bryan, I just want to say thanks for your incredibly hard work and the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours that you've poured into this. Yeah. This is really important research, and it's part of the mosaic of what we're trying to do at ABR, right? We're digging for the truth.
Absolutely.
Right? And we don't want to be afraid of what we find in the archaeological record. We know we can trust the scriptures, and the archaeology, we continue to find more. So thanks for coming in all the way from Canada, and thanks for sharing. Friends, thank you for joining us today for Digging for Truth. We hope you'll take time to consider the work that Bryan has done. Stay tuned for more, because I'm sure there'll be more to talk about. We know that we can trust what the scriptures say, and we often find nuance in the archaeology, but we also find that it bears out exactly what the biblical accounts tell us. We hope you have a great day.